be finessed, but I'm not going to do that here. My point is that many theistic evolution advocates hold positions covering the other 8 points on the grid, and in all those 8 points on the grid, there's just no question that God can get what God wants out of biological history. And moreover, on the top 2/3 of the grid, there's no question that God acted in significant ways during biological history so as to cause some outcomes to occur instead of other outcomes. God's action is not scientifically detectable in this scenario, but God unquestionably acts in ways to produce particular outcomes. Therefore, there's nothing antithetical with the idea of God using natural events, which appear random from a human perspective, as part of a system in which God meaningfully designs and accomplishes the final outcome. Theistic evolution can easily accommodate, and many theistic evolution advocates do believe, the idea that God achieved God's particular desired outcomes for the history of life on Earth through evolution. Okay, so what about this third point? Ought we to expect that God's governance or design of biological history is scientifically detectable? Now, this argument is one of the most common arguments I've heard ID advocates make against theistic evolution. There's a recent example on a new webpage at discovery.org on theistic evolution. I'll skim the quote for you. The quote goes, theistic evolutionists propose God who does... Theistic evolution proponents who do not openly deny that God guided the development of life typically insist his guidance was unobservable in biology. Skipping down again a bit, yet for thousands of years, Jewish and Christian thinkers maintain God's design could be clearly seen in nature, from the psalmist who claimed the heavens declare the glory of God, the Apostle Paul on Romans 1:20. The idea that we can see design in the regularities and functionality of nature is clearly accepted. In fact, Jesus himself pointed to the feeding of birds and the exquisite design of lilies of the field observable evidence of God's active care towards the world and its inhabitants. A very common argument. And I can understand where it's coming from. I have some sympathy with it. So how would most theistic evolution advocates respond? By saying, yes. God's daily feeding of the birds points to God's active care of creation, even though there is no scientifically detectable breaks in natural cause and effect when birds hunt for food and digest their food. Yes, the daily growth and flowering of lilies points to God's active care, even though there are no scientifically detectable breaks in natural cause and effect when flowers grow and bloom. Do you believe the sun, moon, and stars proclaim God's glory, even though we have scientific explanations for how they formed in terms of natural processes? Do you believe that the mountains, the atmosphere, the ocean speak of God's handiwork, even though we can scientifically understand their formation? Of course, we all do. So for this reason, I gotta say, theistic evolutionists find it puzzling, sometimes frustrating, that critics would speak about seeing God's governance of design in every other part of the natural world, including mountains and oceans and stars, even when there are complete scientific descriptions for their formation and functioning in terms of natural processes. And yet, some will insist that we cannot speak of God's design in biological species unless the formation defies explanation in terms of natural processes. Theistic evolutionists respond to this criticism by saying, we see God's design and care in the origin and adaptation of species in exactly the same way we see God's design and care in every other part of the natural world. All right, myth number 4, theistic evolutionists support evolution because they're worried about their jobs or their scientific respectability. I haven't done a broad survey. I can say this myth is simply false for every single theistic evolution advocate I know personally. And of the 8 myths I described, this is the one I say just stomp it out, okay? Stomp them all out. But this one is a particularly destructive myth because it questions the faith commitment of fellow Christians. I've never seen it true in anyone I've ever seen. It impugns the motives and integrity of people who are honestly trying to do their best to understand God's revelations. So it's one that bugs me the most. All right. So, conclusion time. Skip ahead here just a bit. Ultimately, so one of the things we were asked to do was talk about can we define just a few issues that tends to separate the intuitions or the sensibilities of people who tend to lean towards theistic evolution and people who lean towards intelligent design. And that's one of the things we're going to do in the next few minutes. But where do I think this will ultimately get resolved? Ultimately, I think it'll be resolved by investigating the scientific claim of intelligent design. Right now, origins of life, origins of biological complexity are ongoing areas of scientific investigation. They are fascinating questions. Intelligent design advocates believe the evolution of biological complexity is highly improbable, and theistic evolutionists, advocates, believe that the evolution of biological complexity will be shown to be highly probable via the right combination of known natural mechanisms. I think that further research will ultimately settle this issue. Now, in other forums, not here today, I have defended the theistic evolution scientific claim. I have argued that the laws of nature of this universe are exactly the sort which produce complex environments over time, which allow self-assembly of more complex things out of simpler pieces, which allow transfer of information from complex environments into self-replicating organisms. I've also argued that when we look at the different natural mechanisms which can affect biological evolution, point mutations, gene shuffling, gene duplications, transposable elements, horizontal transfer, alternative splicing, multitasking of proteins, redundancy in how some tasks are accomplished, environmental triggers of mutation, RNA editing, genotypic redundancy of phenotypes, large phenotypic changes caused by mutations in gene regulators during development, population heterogeneity, changing environments, environmental overlap zones, sexual selection, extreme natural selection, rich environments rewarding behavioral plasticity, and coevolution, to name a few. When we put them all together, I believe we ought to expect the evolution of biological complexity is probable. But I hold all of those arguments tentatively. I might be wrong. And in tomorrow's session, some ID advocates, whose names Bruce mentioned, will present scientific arguments trying to convince me that I'm wrong. So, is the evolution of biological complexity probable or improbable? We're not really sure yet what the answer is going to be, I say. So, I hope each of us, whether an ID advocate or a theistic evolution advocate, holds his or her position with a certain degree of tentativeness. I hope that by clearing up some of these misconceptions about theistic evolution, that ID advocates realize they could happily embrace some versions of theistic evolution if their scientific arguments about the evolution of complexity fail. And conversely, I hope that by clearing up some misconceptions about ID, that advocates of theistic evolution realize they could happily embrace some versions of ID if their arguments about scientific evolution of complexity fail. And that's it for now. We could just alternately step forward to the mic. Okay. So do you want to say one or two things you think that this has come out of this?
I'm very glad that you have phrased it as, well, let's continue on our respective paths and see what happens in terms of the results that are achieved by each side, and maybe one of us will convince the other eventually. I think that's the healthy approach to take to the whole situation. In regard to your classification of the 9 different categories, whether theologically God determines random events and whether evolution is contingent or not, it occurs to me that there might be resources in Molinist theology for a way of conceptualizing some of this in terms of God's choice of which world to create. And given God's omniscience, he stands back, he looks at the various possible worlds that he might bring into existence, and he observes that if he creates this world as opposed to, say, that world, which he might equally realize, that he will not need to interfere in its development or be active in its development in the same way, such that left to its own devices, it will achieve his end. So that's one way one might consider thinking about some of the more extreme views of God's hands-off approach to creation, though I wonder if the development were improbable, it were a highly improbable world that God had selected, that in itself might warrant a design inference. So there's room for further discussion there. Myth 4. I agree with you. I would not want to impugn anyone's motivation. All I can say from the standpoint of ID advocates is I know that there are a good number of us who have lost jobs because we have embraced an ID research program, and we've been told by various departments that they wanted to distance themselves